Okay, we are live with Qiana Patterson,
Hey,
managing
Joe.
partner at Naya. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here on this a little foggy day here in the Bay Area
Yeah,
with
yeah.
you.
It's a nice change from like the heat wave we've been having. Thank you for visiting us in Berkeley.
Yeah, totally.
Uh, you, I just want to say something about you from the get-go, which is you have one of the best reputations in
Oh my
venture
gosh.
that of like almost anyone I know. And I can't tell you how many founders, operators, investors I've mentioned your name to, and they kind of stop me and their eyes light up and they're like, Qiana is amazing.
Oh, you're making me blush already. That's amazing.
It's true.
Yeah.
And you introduced me to someone recently, and they said on my first phone call, anytime Qiana introduces me to someone, I take the phone call sight unseen, and no matter what. Why is that?
Why do people
Why
say
do,
that about me?
why do people? Why are you so different?
Ooh. I think integrity matters. And I think that doing good things and being a good human is the right thing to do. And if you grow up like me with humble beginnings, like that's all you know is like sort of like what's that boomerang effect, right? If you put out good in the world, then what will come back to you? And so I'm always sort of championing for the little people or those people that are least likely to get access because I was once and sometimes still am that person as well. That's my why.
I believe you. You also strike me as someone who just like what you say is like it's for real.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of an underdog, so I just feel like, what do I have to lose, right? I might as well just say the things that need to be said, and I think that's super important. Time is fleeting. We don't have much time in this world, and I want to maximize the amount of time that I have remaining, and I better use it the best way I know how to. And part of that is just saying the things that need to be said, but in a loving, kind, human, empathetic way. But definitely, it's important to say and do the things that are most urgent.
I love that. I love that. Well, I always enjoy our conversations, and that's why I was so excited to have you here. So we actually met through Cap Table Coalition, an organization we've both been a part of. In my view, it was kind of a strange series of events that led us together. So just the backstory on my side, I want to hear your side too, but like on my side is I was doing some work with Black VC, I was putting on virtual events, and a news story caught my attention. It was the announcement that Richie Cerna at Phoenix was raising this very competitive Series B round. I think Lightspeed was one of the leads. And he made it a point to allocate some of the round for diverse investors from his network. And so that got big publicity on TechCrunch. And then around the same time, there was another gentleman named Derek Anderson from Bevy that was doing something similar with his Series C round, led by Excel. And that inspired me to reach out to both of them. I had met Richie once before. Derek, I hadn't known. To put on an event to kind of explore this idea. And when I talked to Richie, he said, oh, let me introduce you to Emmanuel and tell you about the Cap Table Coalition. I said, what's that? And then Emmanuel said, oh, this sounds like a great event you're putting on. It would be great to add Qiana. Let me introduce you to Qiana. So we ended up having the event with Richie, yourself, and Derek, and it was a big hit. And then I was invited to join the investment committee of Cap Table Coalition. So we've been able to work together in that organization for over a year now.
Over a year.
So for the audience who doesn't know, as well as I do, what is Cap Table Coalition?
Okay, Cap Table Coalition is basically a grassroots initiative between, like you said, initially Richie Cerna, who's the founder and CEO of Phoenix, and several others who came together and said, you know what, part of the way that we are going to build generational wealth and diversify cap tables and do all these things that most marginalized people don't get access to do and have is by diversifying cap tables. And the way that we could essentially do that is by getting founders to push for greater diversity on their cap tables. And it was originally how it all started was Alejandro Guerrero from Act One Ventures, which is an LA-based VC fund. Alejandro is a partner there. He wrote the diversity rider in the summer of 2020. It was his way of sort of doing something. And we all know what was going on that summer. And, Richie was in their portfolio. Phoenix was in the portfolio of Act One. And Richie, because he has humble beginnings, he said, I absolutely, at his Series B, said, I want to do this. And as a result, we were able to raise $3 million. It was a diverse group of people that came together. I was one of the co-managers of that SPV. And what happened was it got publicity, as you said, and more founders came to Richie and said, how did you do this? And cap table didn't exist. We just had this desire to diversify cap tables, one with the, writing on the diversity rider, and founders who were pushing for that. And Richie basically said, well, they're these epic humans, these amazing people who volunteered their time. You should talk to them. And that's the origin of Cap Table Coalition. We just said, what is this? Who are we, right? And we're this coalition of people who want to diversify cap tables. And so that's the birth story of Cap Table Coalition. We started with about 80 or so people, and now we're nearing 800 people who are now a part of this coalition, which is really exciting to see. We went from, investing in one company to investing in more than 30 companies, deploying nearly $27 million in the last year. And that's with no fund. That's just, again, all volunteers, all of us just doing the work to really get access to amazing deal flow and pooling our resources together and our time to do this collectively.
Amazing. And you've been one of the most active members of the investment committee. Can you talk a little bit about some of the companies you've led the investments into?
Yeah. Probably too many at this point. I always sort of wince when people go, you're the most active one. And I go, yeah, and I don't know how I actually find time to do all of it. Tradewell, TRM Labs. There's also, what else? Electio, Charger Help. There's a number of companies, and it ranges from early stage to Series B or C, so later stage. I'm most passionate about founders that really are deeply entrenched in the problem that they're solving, that we click. They can really understand the purpose and the reason why Cap Table exists, and they're really aligned to that. But I have a really good understanding of what they are trying to build and how they are trying to build it. And it just, it's for many of these founders, it just makes sense. My background is in B2B SaaS and ops and strategy. And so when I can really understand the model and the space it's in, and there's some spark about that founder, then I want to lead the charge in raising money for them.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it. And I've kind of had the chance to lead a few. So my first one was Career Karma,
mm-hmm.
And then the second one was Brex that
Mm-hmm.
I led with Tommy, and then the third one we actually led together.
We did,
which is a stealth company.
It is.
Can't talk too much about, but focused on women's health.
Yeah,
and I'm really excited about that one. You mentioned, you don't know how you do it all, mm-hmm. right? And I wanted to ask you about that, right? Because you are managing partner at Naya,
mm-hmm.
you're founding general partner at Tama Capital.
Mm-hmm.
You're involved with a bunch of other organizations. Mm-hmm. How do you, first off, can you kind of help describe some of these organizations, and how do you kind of manage all these projects?
So, my day job is as managing partner for Naya. I am leading investments, and NIA is interesting because it really aligns to, again, sort of my values and core mission around how do we ignite and how do we support and back some of the most phenomenal founders who also happen to be minoritized. And we use that word very specifically because a lot of us and people that look like me are not really truly minorities. Women aren't minorities in this country, right, in this world. But we have been made to be minoritized as a group of people. And so, the work of NIA is really to think about communities, to think about well-being, holistic well-being, financial well-being. And so how do we back founders who have been minoritized? How do we sort of back, things that we believe are really going to be impactful, from direct investments into companies, supporting and helping growing as a studio as well, growing ideas with founders from the ground up, and also making direct investments as an LP into emerging fund managers as well. So we do quite a bit, which it's all in alignment to the work that I do also then with Cap Table Coalition. So your question around how do I do it, it probably fundamentally it's the why, right? There's so much alignment to the work of NIA and the work of Cap Table Coalition that it's something that, because it's so aligned, it seems to me like all one big thing, right? And I just, find time in the evenings to develop memos to really dive into an industry or a particular model, and go from there if I decide to lead a deal. So, I think, I mentioned time earlier, that we don't have enough of it and it's fleeting. But you find the time for the things that matter the most. And, when you meet a founder that, like I said, has that spark, then I'm always willing to find the time. So, between NIA and then Cap Table Coalition, I'm also the chair of Pledge LA, which is an initiative between the mayor's office of Los Angeles and the tech and VC ecosystem. We really want to create a more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable tech and VC ecosystem. And so what are the initiatives that we can do within LA in Southern California to make sure and ensure that happens? So again, all of this work I'm doing is all very aligned to sort of one central purpose, is to how do we create a more equitable and just society, and how does VC and the tech industry sort of have a role and stake in making sure that's possible. And that's how I do it. It's all aligned, and I go to yoga at night to balance myself. Yoga helps to balance me.
Indeed. I like that term, minoritized. I've kind of struggled a little bit with the language, right? Because because it's changing, and B, because it's just, words carry so much weight, right? And, I don't love the term minority because it kind of, feels like less than. And so I've been using words like, underrepresented. And then it's, the question of well, who does that include or not include? So it gets complicated, but I like that word minoritized. That's a new one for me.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Especially if you just think about women, right? We're not a minority, and actually we've been minoritized. And then I think that, you said underrepresented. What I have started, and I started saying several years ago, instead of underrepresented, I've started actually saying underestimated, right? Women, again, are not underrepresented in this society. We're just not. We are, however, underestimated, right? That bias of, whether or not women belong, whether or not we can do something. And this goes for a lot of other groups as well that have been minoritized. But, that fundamental part is really we've been underestimated, and that bias then tells people that we can't or shouldn't or don't deserve to be in certain places at certain tables. And, it is sort of just rooted in that underestimation that why we're not in some places. And so I've moved away from saying minority to minoritized, moving away from underrepresented to underestimated. Yeah.
That makes sense. It's also something I wanted to ask you about in more detail, which is, I mean, just here are some of the stats. I know you know all these, but for other people, less than 3% of any VC partners are Black, less than 1% are Latino, Latina, and 17% are female.
Yeah.
As far as the latest data I've looked at. But that's even overestimating it, right? Because if you look at the dollars that are managed, it's basically for all of those groups, 4% are managed by female and let's say broadly minoritized groups. What is driving this disparity, and what are the biggest levers you think that we can pull as an industry?
Well, so because you're mentioning stats, I'll say this. 97% of all capital, and that's just not venture, but all money, right, in this world is managed by men. 97%. And venture is really small when you think about private equity, hedge, everything, right? Add it all up, trillions of dollars. 97% of all that is actually managed by men, and in particular managed by white men. And so when you think about that, you imagine this pie, right? Over time, the pie just continues to get bigger. It gets bigger and bigger. That share, that 97%, hasn't moved much at all, right? So when we think about the 2% and the 3%, the 4%, right, we're talking about so small amounts. And so I remind myself all the time of this number, right? Because then what it tells me is, why haven't we moved the needle in a significant way? And the only thing that I can describe it or sort of put a finger on the why is that some people just don't want to relinquish power, right? Some people just don't want to let the bag go. And if we imagine how people have come to be money managers, essentially, right? They've done all the things in the correct way, in the very traditional way, whether it's, going to a certain school and then working on Wall Street and being a banker and all those kinds of things, then the numbers of women and other minoritized people in those spaces are relatively small. And so then if you want to get into venture and you didn't go down that path, right, then it's not likely that you're going to get there. And so we have this sort of cascading effect. In my mind, we have this cascading effect that prevents those who are in power and control who gets access to capital to deploy as a major barrier. And that's just, you just can't deny that it is how it is. And so what do we do to sort of push past that, right? To change that is, I think, something that we're still grappling with.
Wow, well described. I mean, yeah, I tend to agree. And it's also good to keep in mind how young venture capital is as an asset class.
That's
right?
right.
It was only created 60, 70 years ago. I mean, it's brand new in the grand scheme of finance. But yes, it seems like traditionally there were these kind of, well-worn paths that were taken. And then I'm a big believer in affinity bias. I tend to think there's, I generally think very well of people. I give people the benefit of the doubt sometimes too much. But I tend to think that a lot of it has to do with I'm not, some people might not purposely be excluding other people, but they just think of themselves.
Right.
And they think of well, this is what I did, or this is, kind of what my growing up was like, or, oh, we went to the same boarding school or things like that. So that's what I've seen. But I mean, I feel like things are moving in the right direction. It just doesn't feel like it's fast enough, and it just feels like the mountain is so high to climb.
Right. And like I said, you've got this pie, 97%, right, is controlled by this one group. And like you said, there's that affinity bias. And so even as we make headway, right, even when we make, what we consider to be certainly in 2021, right, there seem to be a lot of strides made, right? Several of our friends and others that we know raise funds that we would consider to be really great size funds. But in the grand scheme of things, if the pie just continued to get bigger and our slice either remains the same size or dwindles in any year, right, then it also still feels like we haven't made that much of a stride. So there's this for me, it's always sort of that back and forth of well, the pie's getting bigger, right? And so is our slice getting bigger in comparison to the other parts? And so I'd like to think that we have made progress. I know that we've made progress, but I still feel a sense of urgency that it's not enough. It's not fast enough. And can we go faster? Can we do more? And my answer will always be yes, always.
Right. And I mean, I think to that point, because of my beliefs around affinity bias, I tend to believe that more capital needs to be put in the hands of GPs that are actually writing the checks. Like there was a stat that came out recently that said female VCs are twice as likely to invest in female founders. And
That's
I think
right.
that to me is a trend that is probably consistent around all different types of people.
That's right.
So the more we can diversify the venture capital base, the better. Now, and then, so that flows downstream, but it also begs the question, does that flow upstream as well? Like, is that necessary as well? It's a tough question.
I think the easy answer would be yes, right? But the how we do that and how we make those changes, I think is something that hasn't been answered or figured out yet. So, yeah. I don't know if you have an answer, Joe, but I know that, one of the stats that I recently read is women GPs are, like you said, more than twice as likely to write a check into women founders. And I think as an aggregate, a group of diverse fund managers are 21% more likely to write checks into a group of diverse founders, right? And that's so to your point, it's probably across. We know that to be true because the data proves that out. We haven't talked about how many LPs, right, women and others who've been minoritized are writing the checks, right, downstream to fund managers like you and others, right? And there's not that much diversity at that level either, right? And so I think that I always describe it as there's chaos happening, right? And when there's chaos happening, and I'm sure you walk in sometimes to your living room and there's Legos and there's all kinds of things all over the place, and which Lego do you grab first, right? Which one? There's toys, there's Legos, there's all kinds of things, but which one do you grab first? Well, you just have to start somewhere, right? And so what I sort of see in my mind is that during that chaos, the Legos and toys and everything are everywhere. You just have to start grabbing. But then what happens when your son is also at the toy chest and still pulling things out, right? And dumping it onto the ground? We still just have to keep on picking up. And I feel that that's where we're at, right? The kids are still dumping Legos and toys out. You're grabbing, and now you've got your hands full of Legos and all kinds of things and trucks and dolls and everything. And still there's more coming out. And so I think that's oftentimes how I feel, but I still have to just keep on picking up. Right. And I feel like that's where we're at. We're okay, I know that I see that we need to have more, fund managers that look like you and I. great, let's do it. Like, let's fund more people. But then, like, we don't see the fact that there's like this pie that's getting bigger. These LPs are writing, more massive sized checks. There's all these things happening all at the same time. And you're like, is it making a difference? Is it truly making a difference, right? In some years, it feels like, yes, we've done it. And in other years, most recent year, we're just like, oh no, maybe that wasn't enough. Right. So, I just feel like, I'm just going to keep on grabbing the Legos that I see.
This analogy is really working for me. I feel like
I assume you've picked up a lot of Legos.
Every day. No, that's really working for me. I mean, I do feel like the tide is changing, at least from all the conversations I'm having with LPs. Like it feels like it's moving from an intentionality to action. And again, like, in the grand scheme of things, it's small steps, but I do feel like steps are being made. I mean, and one thing that resonates when we talk about, having diverse teams, you mentioned a stat around like diverse venture partnerships. Harvard Business Review did a study in 2018. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but that basically said venture capital firms that are heterogeneous actually outperform 26 to 32%. It's Professor Paul Gompers, who was one of the professors who worked on that. And that's pretty intriguing as well, right? Because when you start just looking at the numbers and performance, people's eyes, like regardless of like whatever their biases are, they start to say, that's interesting. If I can make more money, then increase my returns.
It's interesting. You say that it's intriguing, right? So I'll push back a little bit. Is it intriguing, right? Is it really intriguing? Is that a surprise to us, right? At this point, especially 2018, is that really intriguing? Or is it something that should tell us, wow, we've royally screwed up for a long time.
Right.
And how do we, like, in the most immediate way, get on the right train? We've been going the wrong direction for a long time, right? And this is just like plain as day, right? Here it is, factually. And what are you going to do about it right now? Not like, I think what people have done is go, that's intriguing. And so by saying, that's intriguing, it gives you time to pause, to like settle in with that. And I don't think that we have time to settle in with it. You have to take that information, right? Those facts, and you have to act upon it. Because I think that to sort of like settle in the intrigue gives us time to like settle into it, right? Get comfortable with it. And I don't think we should get comfortable with that. I think we should be really, truly uncomfortable with the fact that we've been doing things wrong, right? And we have to like move to the side that should actually make us comfortable. Move to the side of those fund managers, right, who are heterogeneous, right, in that way. And
right.
Yeah.
I agree in that it shouldn't be intriguing.
No, that's right. It shouldn't be.
That's right. And I do feel like for a lot of people, the light bulb goes off, right? And they're like, well, intuitively that would make sense. Like we've all worked on school projects together, and like when people disagree and they have different opinions or different backgrounds, like that is almost always additive. So I agree with you. And I agree with your sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. We're going to talk about your journey, but like given the state of where things are today and where we think they're going, what advice would you have for aspiring investors from underrepresented groups? Maybe they're operators like you used to be. Maybe they're, maybe they're not even in tech, right? Which we're going to talk about. But like, what would your advice be to those folks?
To the founders in particular?
Founders or aspiring investors.
Well, listen, I think that the best investors are those people who have the best relationships with founders. And so I think aspiring investors should root themselves in founder relationships, and root themselves in what types of problems are being solved and the why and what brings a particular founder to that journey or to that point in their lives where they want to tackle something. I think for me, like, and we're going to talk about my journey, but like my initial sort of like pathway was like leaning in and supporting founders long before I wrote any check to anyone. And so while I recognize that all founders are different, right, in how they think and how they solve problems, which is the beauty of it all, I think that being a champion and advocate of founders is probably the key to it. And so before you even start writing a check, you sort of pause and say, how can I help this particular founder? What can I do? With a sort of an eye to and a pathway towards being founder friendly, being, founder centric in that sense, and spending as much time as you possibly can with founders. Yeah.
Value add.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree in that. I often tell people you can be a VC. You can do everything a VC does except write the check.
That's right.
Right? And that's usually a good path to not only learning what it's like to add value, but also to figure out if you like it. Like a lot of people think they would like being a venture investor, and then they get into it and they're like, oh, this isn't sexy. This isn't fun.
Yeah, like I tell people all the time, this is not sexy work. Right? It is not sexy work at all. And it's funny because I think you're like part therapist and you're part like accountant and you're like part, lawyer, and you're like all these things that you like I didn't realize, but here I am, but I think that the core and the central thing is like you're a really good listener, right? You're a really good listener. You're a really good person who understands and can sort of be empathetic to founders. And so that's why I say like that part therapist is probably really key and really critical because, I would say 90% of the time it's just not sexy. It is not sexy at all. No.
I agree. Well, let's shift the conversation to you, and let's just start way back. Like, what was it like growing up in Seattle, and like how are some of your early like lessons or experiences like kind of shaped you?
Really great question. So I am not ashamed to say it, but my mother had 2 children by the time she was 19. She did not finish high school. And my brother and I, my older brother, and I actually were taken away from our mother at a very young age. I probably was less than 1 at that point in my life, and I was never returned to her. So I tell that story because statistically, I should not be here with you, at this mic. And it's not to say that I don't belong here, I don't deserve to be here, but like just from a stats, sort of way to think about it, someone who's born to a teenage mom, to someone who didn't graduate from high school, usually based on, statistically doesn't make it this far. And so very, very humble beginnings. Ultimately, I was raised by my father as a single father. My dad, was in the Navy. He finished high school and spent time in the Navy. My upbringing in Seattle was one of being a latchkey kid, spending a lot of time by myself after school, watching a lot of public television, cooking shows, and obviously educational types of things, reading a lot. I was a really curious kid. And I was really curious, but I didn't oftentimes have a lot of people around me to ask questions to. So I did a lot of writing and reading and thinking and writing questions down. So I've always been one of those kids that had on their on their report card that little code that says talks too much. I needed an outlet once I got to school. And so I did that because I spent a lot of time alone. But, you know, a lot of love, a support system, and people who genuinely believed in me, but didn't always know what that meant, right? I grew up with the sense that I was supposed to go to college, but there wasn't anyone who really understood how you were supposed to go to college, what you needed to do. So there was a lot of figuring things out on my own. So, you know, I went to college and in Seattle, went to the best university in the state of Washington, the University of Washington. I'm a Husky. It was a big deal in my family to go to college. It's a big deal in my family for me to graduate 4 years later. So that's the beginning and the origin of the story of me. One thing that I like to tell people even now, and it didn't dawn on me until many years later, is that, you know, I grew up in Seattle in the shadows of Microsoft and Amazon and Starbucks and, you know, Boeing and Weyerhaeuser, some like major companies, like amazing founder stories. I didn't know anybody who worked for any of those companies. There was no one in my neighborhood. There was no one in my family who worked at any of those companies. I knew they existed. I grew up in the shadows of those companies and these giants, but had no connection to it. And I always like to say, like, how do you dream of being a marine biologist if you've never felt sand between your toes? You can think about it, right? You can think about it. You can read about it. You can Google it. You can do all those things, but like, does it really seep in for you? Right? And I didn't know what was possible, right? I didn't know what was possible because part of my life was, you know, sheltered, or not sheltered, but like there was clear divisions and lines and barriers. They were invisible. They were there, but I didn't recognize them. I didn't know what was on the other side. I didn't know that there was another side. This was just the life that I was living. And so it wasn't until I look back, you know, much later in life that I said, oh, wow, like, you know, what would my life have been like, right, if someone worked at Microsoft in my family? If, you know, a neighbor was an engineer, you know, at Boeing, right? Like what my life would have been like. And it's not to like sort of like bemoan that, but it's the reality of sort of like how our society is constructed in a way that sort of, you know, serves as barriers for people sort of dreaming what's possible. But I'm very thankful that there were small seeds planted in me very young, and that while I saw a lot of things that were impossible, I'm very thankful for my dad sort of raising me in a way that was like very like, you can do anything. But I wasn't always sure what that anything was. But because he sort of planted that seed that anything was possible, that I just needed to understand what the possibilities were, that here's where I'm at today.
Whoa, that was amazing.
Yeah.
I did not know all that background. That's what I love about these podcasts, is that we get to go so deep.
Yeah.
Underdog. The quintessential underdog.
100%. I mean, yeah. And then I became a teacher.
Yes, I want to hear that too. So, but just not to lose the point,
Mm-hmm.
the not knowing what you don't know, right? That is so critical. I mean, you know, growing up, I had no idea what an engineer was,
Yeah.
right? Like I thought it was like a train conductor.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I applied to school for math, and then like I met another guy in my high school or who was at Lehigh where I was accepted. He was like, "Hey, have you thought about engineering?" I'm like, "No, I'm not into trains." He's like, "No, it's not like that." And so he was like, "Oh, you can apply math, right?" And so I kind of called up the school. I said, "I want to be an engineer." They were like, "See ya, all right, see ya." But it's that exposure.
That's right.
And I mean, presumably because of the internet, I mean, you and I grew up like without the internet, basically, right? We had TV, right? But presumably with the internet, there's more access to this. But I also feel like, our country and like probably the world more generally is so culturally transfixed, right? And isolated in different ways. So I wonder if there's been a lot of progress.
Yeah, there's been progress.
Yeah.
There's been progress. And I think that the runway keeps on getting longer. So we keep going further, right? There's progress. But then there's greater inequities, and that just keeps on furthering out. So it feels like there's this like never ending sort of like where the finish line is continues to like move forward, right? We're moving forward, and yet the finish line too is moving forward at the same time, sometimes faster, maybe sometimes slower. Sometimes we see the finish line, sometimes we don't. Nevertheless, we are moving forward. There is progress. I'm very happy to say my younger sister has gone to college, and I have nieces who dream of going to college. And so I consider, and I have cousins who've gone to college and have great careers. I have several engineer cousins now. So there's progress, certainly in my family, certainly in communities that I grew up in the communities that I live in now. There is progress, and yet we still have much further to go.
And I think that's why it's so important, for people like us to like leave breadcrumbs, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like, this is how, I mean, that's like partially like why we're doing this, right? Is like, this is how Qiana got to where she is today. On LinkedIn, it's like, she looks like a superhero. But if you hear her story, you can tell like, okay, there was a long path there. And I don't want to skip over your point about the finish line getting longer. That's a really compelling analogy, which I have to think more about. But okay, so I want to just understand like this path, right? Because you were an anthropology major, you were a teacher, a dean of students, an ed tech startup operator, and now an investor, and I would say thought leader. What did that journey look like, and like what kind of pulled you in those, along that path?
So I became a teacher because I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing after I graduated undergrad. One of the most impactful, inspiring people in my life. And remember, I had, somewhat of a rough sort of go at life early on, was my sixth grade teacher, Miss Chisholm. She was just a force to be reckoned with. And I became her. I became a sixth grade teacher. I love teaching. I taught English and history and sixth grade, and that's a wild and funny bunch of children, 11 and 12-year-olds, all the kinds of things that their bodies and their minds and changes that are happening. It's the best year ever. I love teaching. I was a teacher for 5 years. And then I was a dean for 2 years, so spent a total of 7 years in this one particular middle school in LA. I loved it. I absolutely love teaching. I love being an educator. I just didn't know if I was better at something else. I started teaching when I was really young. And I figured, you know what? Maybe I should try something else. And if I fail at that something else, I can go back to teaching. And I think at the time it just made sense to me. looking back and as we look at history, what we realize is that Gen X is the first generation of people that started to have multiple careers, right? After boomers and that like in between group after the boomers, I forgot what they're called. But we're the first generation that started to have multiple careers and a generation that said it's okay to change. It's okay to spend, half of your career as one thing and decide you want to do something else. And of course, family and friends were like, wait, you're going to leave? You're like on this trajectory to do all these amazing things and you're an administrator and all these things. And I was just like, well, yeah, but I want to try something else. And again, sort of that fearlessness of like trying something else. You fail and you can go back. And that try something else led me to, ed tech. It was a good transition. I was an educator moving into the tech space, sold a product. It was a B2B SaaS product into schools and districts. And I became a trainer on that software and quickly moved up from trainer to a project manager to senior project manager to VP of Ops. And the last role that I had in that first company was interim CEO. So, I just learned that I can do other things and I might actually be good at those other things. And so that was just, teacher to tech and then, spending a lot of time in the tech space, in particular ed tech, didn't see a lot of people that looked like me. When I did see people that looked like me and founders and others, they sort of gravitated towards me like a magnet. And one friend tells me he saw me at a conference and he goes, she looks like she knows what she's doing. And we became fast friends. And he was early stage founder. And, so that's, I think, how I was able to sort of, again, root myself in like this founder first sort of journeys and really helping and supporting founders and sort of, I think, telling them the things that I had experienced and how I sort of did my work and what strategies that they could push on and levers they could pull. And here we are. Now they call me an investor.
I love it. It's I tend to think that teaching is actually kind of one of the under discussed skills that is necessary in VC, right? Because in terms of how do you help entrepreneurs, it's usually sharing lessons from either your own experience or experience working with other entrepreneurs. And I think that's critical. I mean, that's something I would be attracted to, teaching and I've done some work there and I feel like that's something that I like doing as well. So I think we have that in common.
One thing that I would say about, one being an anthropology major, right, which is really just the study of humans, right, from language to culture to geography, all these things. And then being a teacher, right, I, at that point or in this point in my life have had hundreds of kids, right, that I've been responsible for. And as I look back, like those were just young humans, right? And, you're in a classroom of 30 plus children, right? These young humans who have, all the things that we all have in a company too. You have, different types of learners, you have different types of people who have different skill sets, all of those things. And so I figured, well, what I was able to do was sort of take this idea and this concept of how do you treat, these learners, right? This classroom full of all these different types of learners. They learn different ways. They gravitate to different things. They have different types of interests. And how do you sort of pull all of those people, right? These young people forward in a mission. And I think it's very much the same way if you're the founder of a company, you're leading a team. Like, how do you get these different individuals, right, to get on one accord together, marching towards one particular goal? When I was a teacher, I needed to get them from early man to the fall of Rome in a span of 9 months, right? And, you think about it, like if you've got to push out product and you've got KPIs and you've got OKRs and you break it down by quarter or a year, and those all things are important. You got to pull all those people and get them to one unified goal, right? And place and time. And I feel like because I was a really good teacher, if I say it myself, I was a good teacher, and so it made me a good listener. It made me a good person to recognize when someone was having a bad day, a bad week, for any number of reasons. And how do you inspire? How do you create? How do you catalyze, captivate people in a way to sort of have this shared goal? And I think good leaders have the capacity to do that. And certainly I think some of the best leaders that we have on this earth are teachers.
And if you can do all that with sixth graders, with all those hormones and whatnot, it's easy to do with adults.
Yeah.
What would you say, we're going to go to the personal philosophy side of things here. Yeah. What would you say is your superpower?
Ooh, my superpower. Listening and connecting on a human level with people. Yeah. And listening and understanding and really sort of figuring out where people want to go and then trying to latch myself on to how do I help. I think that's my superpower.
What's one thing you believe that other people do not believe?
Ooh, my contrarian.
Your contrarian opinion.
Okay, drum roll. Lots has happened and had been said about how do we sort of move this needle further and faster. And some people believe that the way to sort of diversify, create more equity and diversity within this ecosystem is if we get more check writers that look like you and me. And while I believe that does need to happen, I do not believe that it is enough. And I do not believe that that's the pathway to significant change or an overhaul to how this ecosystem looks. My most contrarian belief is that we actually need to get more white men at this point in time, because they are the ones who have have more money than under management and hold most of the power and control over capital in this country. We actually need to get them to write checks. It is not enough. You could give 100 more Black fund managers, $50 million funds, and it still wouldn't be enough. It just wouldn't. So my most contrarian belief is that white men in particular, we need to sort of educate them in a way that gets them to take the facts that we know, and you shared that earlier, that writing checks into women who over-index and are more successful as an aggregate than other founders, and all these other stats that we know to be true, if we can just get them to believe those facts and then thus follow the money and write checks into those types of founders and into fund managers that look like you and me, then we actually get faster, much further, and we would have greater equity, and we would have, in my belief, a more just and better society. And that is just what I believe to be true. It's just not enough for me and you to have more money under management. We actually need more white men to believe that, a founder that looks like you and me should not be underestimated. Yeah.
Right. And to not be intrigued by that data, but
not
to
be
believe
intrigued.
it.
No pausing. Right. Let's act with urgency.
Is there a quote you think about or live by?
I do really believe that it is possible to do well by doing good. And I think that quote and that sort of mantra extends across every aspect of my life. Like, what does that look like, right? In terms of the companies we develop, what what types of problems should be solved for. I think it just extends to every aspect of my life. And I always think about, like, what's the thing that I can do that does a little bit of good in this world, and what sort of impact that would have, right? So it's not about impact, or, people sort of see impact investing and things like that to be sort of like a negative or charity or nonprofit. I'm simply saying that if you see a problem in this world and there's this idea and this concept around, what are the things that need to be changed fundamentally? There's a founder that I really like, Chris Bennett, is the founder of Wonder School, right? He sort of sees the problem and the urgent issue around, childcare in this country, right? He's building a phenomenal business around doing something that solves a major problem. It is doing good in this world, and he can fundamentally do well as a businessman doing that good. And so that's the philosophy that I have and that I live by.
Absolutely. And clearly we share that point of view. Last question for you. What would you want, or what would you want to say at the end of your life, and or what would you want said about you?
I would like people to say that I was a really good teacher. And I would like people to believe and sort of know wholeheartedly that everything that I'm attempting to do now and will do and have done has been like an act of selflessness. Like, I'm doing what I do now because I believe that there are 1,000 little Qianas out there in the world, thousands of them, who deserve, who have the capability to be doing this and far more, far greater than I can ever do in my lifetime. And so I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for the little Qiana who had a lot of questions and no one to answer them. And the little Qiana who, in the summertime got free lunch at the park. And the little Qianas that exist in this world today that will this summer get free lunches in the park. And that might be their only meal that they have today. I'm doing that so that young women and girls and others know that anything is possible. And then it's my job and other people's job to remove any barrier, right, that exists, that serves to be a barrier or a nuisance for them actually propelling forward. And I know those barriers exist. It is my job to remove those barriers. It is not enough to throw down a rope or to put down a ladder, or you said earlier to sort of have breadcrumbs, right? I want there to be a clear path, Joe. I don't want there to be any barriers. I want them to see and to grab on to their hopes and their dreams without any barriers. And it doesn't mean that that means no hard work and no effort. It just means that there aren't systemic and structural barriers that actually serve and have been built to actually be a barrier, right? And to lock certain people out. And I want people to say that, like, she did everything in her power to fundamentally break down every barrier that was possible, and then she didn't believe that a ladder or a rope was enough.
Beautiful. We can't top that. And you are the master of analogies. I'm seeing the teacher come out here.
Now you see the teacher in me.
And my biggest compliment I can give to you is, like, I believe every single word you say, right? You just come across as one of the most authentic people. And thank you for being so candid, for sharing your thoughts, your stories, your experiences. And it's just, a pleasure to be able to work with you and to have you on the podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. And I'm looking forward to doing a lot more work with you in the future. And I hope this was, awesome and epic for all your listeners.
Absolutely. And how can, if people fall in love with you, how can they follow you or keep track of what you're doing?
I'm definitely on Twitter. You can just, find me on Twitter, and definitely reach out to me or DM me if you want to talk a little bit further. I'm happy to always do that. And definitely follow Cap Table Coalition on Twitter, and check us out online at our website, captablecoalition.com. We're doing really amazing things, and we have big plans for the coming years. And so we want more people to be a part of the coalition. Sign up to be a community member. Sign the pledge, the Diversity Rider Pledge as well. If you're a company leader and CEO that you want to pledge to, diversify your own cap table, take us up on that offer, and we'll help to see that possible for you.
Absolutely. And the Cap Table Coalition, just to clarify, is who's eligible to join the Cap Table Coalition as a member?
Accredited investors, obviously that's an important thing. Accredited investors and people who believe in this mission, right? Who believe that cap tables should be full of diverse and strategic and operators. And so if you're one of those types of people, you're an operator, you have deep expertise in any industry, you're accredited, and you believe that you have a value add to provide founders, then you should sign up.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you again, Qiana. I really appreciate having you.
Thanks, Joe.
All right.